The surveillance started before Darnell Whitaker's blind date ended. The woman across from him stood to leave. Another entered without scanning tables, walked straight to his chair, sat in a seat still warm. "You don't remember me," she said. "But you stopped on a frozen highway in Ellsworth County until my son was pulled from a wreck." But what came next destroyed everything Darnell believed about that night. The date had never been a date. It was a verification protocol, confirming he behaved exactly as 3 insurance files predicted: reliable, patient, dangerously consistent. The sitter watching his daughter? Recommended 3 weeks ago with Nia's school district and their duplex address already attached. Drop a comment where you're watching from and subscribe before quiet systems decide your integrity makes you inconvenient. Because Darnell is about to discover how many drivers get positioned for freight theft accusations they never committed simply because someone needed a predictable variable to absorb unexplainable losses. The door opened again before Darnell Whitaker could stand, before he could reach for the jacket draped over the chair his date had abandoned 3 minutes earlier. And the woman who stepped inside didn't scan the tables the way strangers do when they're looking for someone they've never met. She walked straight toward him through the half-empty restaurant on Massachusetts Street in Lawrence, Kansas, stopped at the edge of his table, where the waiter had just cleared 2 untouched dessert menus, and spoke without raising her voice or offering her hand. "You don't remember me," she said evenly, "but you parked your rig on the shoulder outside Ellsworth County during a whiteout and stayed until my son was pulled from the cab." Darnell's first thought wasn't confusion or recognition. His first thought was that he'd left Nia with a sitter he couldn't really afford to be here, that he'd taken the night off from the overnight freight run that paid her school supplies and the rent on their duplex near the Wakarusa Creek Bridge, and now a stranger was standing over him, speaking in complete sentences about a night he had spent trying to forget because remembering it meant accepting how close he'd come to driving past. The date that just ended had been failing for 40 minutes, each pause stretching until the woman across from him finally said she needed air and left. And Darnell had been reaching for his wallet when this woman appeared instead. She took the empty chair without asking, the one still warm from someone who decided Darnell wasn't worth staying for, and introduced herself as Calla Monroe. She didn't apologize for interrupting. She didn't explain why she'd walked into a restaurant in Lawrence on a Thursday night in September and approached a man she claimed to remember from a county 70 miles west. She didn't thank him for Ellsworth, which was the part that made Darnell's hands go still against the table, because gratitude delivered a year late usually came with explanation. And explanation required time neither of them seemed to have. Instead, Calla folded her hands on the table between the water glass still sweating condensation and the menu the waiter had stopped trying to take, and said the sentence that made everything before it feel like misdirection. "I've been trying to find you for almost a year." The room didn't tighten the way it does in movies when danger walks through the door. The couple 3 tables over kept laughing. The kitchen kept clattering. But Darnell felt the weight of her words settle in the space between them like a bill he hadn't known was overdue, and understood that whatever this woman wanted, it wasn't closure. Subscribe before systems decide who you are without asking. Outside, traffic moved east toward Topeka, and somewhere in a duplex near Wakarusa Creek, Nia was probably asleep with the hallway light on the way she always asked him to leave it. And Darnell sat across from a woman who'd been looking for him long enough to know exactly where he'd be tonight. Ellsworth County came back to Darnell in fragments that refused to arrive in order, the way memories do when they've been stored under pressure for too long. The frozen highway first, Interstate 70 west of Canopolis Lake, where the wind came across open country with nothing to slow it down and turned snow into something that moved horizontally instead of falling. Then the sound, wind screaming through the cab's weather, stripping loud enough to drown out the radio he'd given up on 20 miles earlier. The boy had been standing on the shoulder in a hoodie that looked gray under the floodlights but was probably meant to be black, thin enough that Darnell could see the kid's shoulders shaking from 200 feet away. Teeth chattering so hard, he'd heard it over the idling diesel, when he'd finally climbed down to ask if anyone was coming. No one had been coming. The wrecker was 3 hours out. The cab the kid had been riding in was angled into the median, with its flashers dead and its driver already gone. Taken by ambulance to Salina with a head injury that would later turn out to be minor but felt catastrophic in the moment. Darnell had stayed because leaving wasn't a decision he could make, not with a 17-year-old kid whose hands had gone numb waiting for help that kept getting delayed. And he'd stayed long enough that by the time the wrecker arrived, the boy's mother had called Darnell's phone 6 times asking if her son was still breathing. He remembered her voice, tight, controlled, breaking only once when she'd said thank you in a way that sounded more like a confession than gratitude. What he didn't remember was giving anyone his phone number, which meant someone else had. But the woman sitting across from him now didn't sound grateful. Kala Monroe spoke about Ellsworth the way someone describes evidence, factual and unburdened by sentiment, and when Darnell opened his mouth to say it hadn't been anything worth remembering this long, she raised one hand slightly, not to silence him but to redirect him, the way a lawyer does when a witness starts answering the wrong question. "I know you don't think it was significant," she said. "That's part of why I needed to find you." Darnell's confusion must have shown because Kala leaned forward slightly, not in the way people do when they're trying to build intimacy, but the way someone does when they're about to explain why the ordinary thing you thought you understood was never ordinary at all. She worked contract investigations for an insurance consortium based out of Des Moines, she said, the kind of firm that handled freight losses quietly across Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana, the kind of cases that got resolved on spreadsheets instead of courtrooms. Ellsworth had crossed her desk 8 months ago because the accident payout had been processed unusually fast, signed off without the internal resistance those claims normally triggered, without the secondary reviews that were supposed to happen when drivers went off-road in weather that made liability complicated. Someone had wanted that file closed quickly, which was the first thing that made her look closer. "You were mentioned in the file," Kala said, and Darnell felt the floor of the restaurant shift slightly beneath him. Not as a witness. Not as someone who needed to be interviewed. Just present. Logged. Noted. She said it the way someone delivers a diagnosis that doesn't have a name yet, and Darnell understood that whatever this conversation was about, it had stopped being about that night in Ellsworth the moment she'd sat down. Gratitude would have been easier. Gratitude would have let him leave. But Kala wasn't here to thank him for something that happened a year ago. She was here because his presence that night had marked him as something the system didn't know how to categorize, and in the months since, she'd been trying to understand whether that made him useful or whether it made him a problem they'd eventually need to solve. Darnell's first instinct was to treat Kala Monroe the way he treated most people who approached him with questions about his work, with the kind of practiced politeness that kept conversations short and commitments non-existent, but something about the way she'd structured her sentences made deflection feel pointless. She wasn't asking for cooperation. She was explaining what had already happened, and the difference settled between them like terms neither of them had agreed to, but both were expected to honor. The consortium she worked for operated quietly across state lines, Kala said, tracking freight losses that insurance companies preferred to manage internally, rather than escalate to law enforcement or public record. Kansas to Missouri to Illinois to Indiana, corridors where cargo disappeared in ways that resisted pattern recognition, where theft looked random enough to justify payouts but frequent enough to demand investigation. Her job wasn't to recover stolen goods or arrest drivers. Her job was to map behavior, to identify variables that didn't fit the models her employers used to calculate risk and determine which claims deserved resistance and which ones could be processed without triggering audits that exposed uncomfortable patterns. Darnell's coffee had gone cold while she spoke, but he didn't reach for it, because reaching for anything felt like admitting he was comfortable with where this conversation was headed. Ellsworth had appeared in her files as an anomaly, not because of what happened, but because of how quickly the paperwork moved afterward, signed off and closed before the usual friction could slow it down. And when she'd pulled the incident report to understand why, Darnell's name had appeared in a way that made her pause, not as someone who needed questioning, not as someone whose story contradicted the official account. Just present. The way a landmark gets noted on a map not because it matters but because it exists in a location where other things have happened. Your name showed up in 3 other files after that, Kala said, her voice steady in a way that suggested she'd already decided how much of this conversation she could justify before it became something her employer would consider a breach. Different routes, different companies, different loss patterns, but always within 40 miles of where cargo went missing, and always logged as someone who showed up on time, kept clean records, and left when others started cutting corners. Darnell felt something cold settle in his chest. The kind of cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with understanding that the rules he'd been following his entire adult life had somehow rearranged themselves while he wasn't looking. His hands had been resting flat on the table, but now they were gripping the edge hard enough that his knuckles showed white against his skin. He wanted to ask what she meant by loss patterns, whether she was accusing him of something he couldn't name yet, but the question caught in his throat because asking it felt like admitting he understood the shape of what she wasn't saying. Kala must have seen the hesitation because she leaned back slightly, giving him space to process what she'd just handed him. And when she spoke again, her tone shifted into something that felt almost like reassurance, except for the fact that nothing she'd said since sitting down had been designed to comfort him. She glanced at her watch, not obviously, but enough that Darnell noticed, and he understood that whatever she was about to say next had a timeline attached to it. "The sitter you're paying tonight," she said quietly, and Darnell's hands went still against the table. "She was recommended by your dispatcher 3 weeks ago." The sentence didn't land like accusation. It landed like information that had been waiting for the right moment to announce itself, and Darnell felt the edges of his understanding start to fray because Nia's sitter had seemed fine, responsible, the kind of college student who showed up early and texted updates without being asked, and the idea that her presence in his life had been engineered by someone he trusted enough to hand his schedule over to felt like discovering that the foundation of his house had been built on sand that was already shifting. "Are you here to tell me I'm under investigation?" Darnell asked, and his voice came out harder than he'd intended, not angry yet, but close enough that he could feel the anger waiting just behind the question. Calla held his gaze without flinching. "No," she said evenly, "I'm here because you're not." The contradiction hung between them for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, and then she finished the sentence in a way that made everything before it feel like misdirection. "And that's the problem." Darnell opened his mouth to ask what she meant by that, to demand an explanation for why his absence from an investigation counted as a problem when most people spent their entire lives trying to stay clear of systems that noticed them at all. But Calla raised her hand again in that same slight gesture that meant the question he was about to ask wasn't the one that mattered. "The woman who left 10 minutes ago," Calla said, and Darnell felt the floor shift again, harder this time. "She wasn't here for a date." The sentence arrived without apology or preamble, delivered in the same measured tone Calla had used for everything else. And for a moment Darnell couldn't process what she was saying because processing it would require accepting that the evening he'd been living through for the past hour hadn't been what he thought it was, that the awkward silences and the untouched iced tea and the polite exit that had felt like failure were something else entirely, something that had been watching him the way a quality control inspector watches a machine to confirm it performs exactly as the specifications promise. "She works contract verification for the same consortium I do," Kaya continued, and her voice stayed level, in a way that suggested she'd known how this part of the conversation would land, and had decided to say it anyway. "Her job tonight wasn't to see if you were dateable, it was to confirm you were real, consistent, and still behaving exactly the way the files suggested you would, showing up on time, keeping your appearance clean, leaving without making a scene when things didn't go your way." Darnell felt something inside him go very still. The kind of stillness that comes right before understanding arrives and rearranges everything that came before it. The date hadn't been a setup in the way he'd assumed setups worked, where someone engineered romance for reasons that had nothing to do with connection. The date had been a field test, a verification protocol disguised as social interaction, and every moment he'd spent trying to be polite and present and normal had been recorded not as evidence of his character, but as confirmation that he matched a profile someone had built from logistics reports and shift logs and the kind of data points that don't feel like surveillance until someone explains what they've been used for. "The pauses," Darnell said quietly, and his voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "The way she kept checking her phone. She was noting your reactions," Kaya said. "How long it took you to respond to silence. Whether you filled gaps with conversation or waited. Whether you showed frustration or stayed patient when it became obvious the evening wasn't what you'd hoped for." Darnell thought about the moment when the woman had said she needed air, the way he'd nodded and started reaching for his wallet without protest, and understood that his dignity in that moment, the quiet acceptance he'd been proud of because it meant he could handle disappointment without bitterness, had been exactly what they'd been looking for. Not romance, not chemistry. Predictability. The kind of behavioral consistency that made him useful as a reference point, a fixed variable in calculations that needed someone to stay exactly where the paperwork said they'd be. "You showed up tonight because someone told you this was a chance to build something normal," Calla said, and there was something in her voice now that hadn't been there before. Something that sounded almost like regret, except regret would have required her to believe she could have stopped this before it started. "But normal isn't what they needed from you. They needed proof that you'd keep following patterns even when those patterns hurt you." Darnell's hands were shaking now, not violently but enough that he pressed them flat against the table to stop the tremor from becoming visible, and he realized that his entire relationship with reliability, the thing he'd built his life around since his wife died and left him alone with Nia and a freight schedule that required him to be someone people could count on, had been turned into something that tracked him instead of protecting him. Your presence disproves official explanations, Kala said quietly, and the sentence landed with the weight of something that had been true for months before Darnell understood he was part of a story he'd never agreed to be written into. They moved outside because staying in the restaurant had started to feel like performing for an audience neither of them had invited, and the sidewalk on Massachusetts Street gave them space to breathe, without the waiter returning every 7 minutes to ask if they needed anything else. Traffic rolled east toward Topeka, headlights cutting through the September evening in steady procession, and Darnell stood with his back against the brick exterior of a building he'd walked past 100 times without noticing, and listened to Calla Monroe explain how institutional risk management worked when the institutions involved preferred not to name themselves publicly. Freight losses happened, she said, with a frequency that insurance companies had learned to predict the way meteorologists predict weather patterns, and most of the time those losses got absorbed into premiums and written off as operational cost, the price of moving goods across distances where oversight thinned and opportunity multiplied. But when theft patterns became expensive enough to trigger internal audits, someone had to absorb the uncertainty, and the question that mattered wasn't who stole what, but how to structure explanations in ways that protected the companies writing the policies from having to admit their models didn't account for the variables actually driving the losses. They're not building cases against drivers, Calla said, and her voice stayed low even though the sidewalk was mostly empty except for a couple walking a dog 2 blocks south. They're building defenses for companies. When theft patterns start costing more than the policies can cover quietly, someone needs to become the reason those patterns make sense. And it's easier to point at behavioral anomalies in logistics reports than it is to admit the system itself creates the conditions that make theft profitable. Darnell thought about the routes he'd driven over the past 3 years, the stops between Salina and Kansas City, the way stations outside Columbia where he'd pulled over to sleep because pushing through exhaustion felt less responsible than arriving late, the fuel stops in Effingham where the lot was always half full of rigs whose drivers he recognized by sight but never by name. Every state Calla had named earlier, Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, was a state Darnell had fueled up in, waited in line at a way station in, pulled over to sleep in when the hours ran longer than the regulations allowed. His route wasn't incidental to the problem they were building explanations around. His route was the problem's infrastructure, and his consistency, the thing he'd believed made him valuable, had turned him into a reference point they could use to make other people's deviations look intentional. "You're telling me I'm being set up," Darnell said. And the words felt too simple for what Calla was actually describing, but he didn't have better language for the shape of what she was handing him. "I'm telling you the setup doesn't require anyone to decide you're guilty," Calla said. "It just requires your presence to be documented in enough places that when someone needs an explanation for why cargo went missing, your name is already in the file as someone who was nearby and demonstrated unusual reliability, which can be reframed as someone who knew how to avoid scrutiny." The logic felt airtight in a way that made Darnell's chest tighten, because it didn't require conspiracy or malice, just administrative efficiency, the kind of paperwork that moved through departments without anyone questioning whether the categories being used to organize human behavior actually reflected the humans being categorized. Systems didn't need villains, he realized. They just needed variables that stayed predictable long enough to be useful when explanations became necessary. "When does this happen?" Darnell asked. "When do they decide I'm the explanation they need?" Calla's expression didn't change, but something in the set of her shoulders shifted, and Darnell understood, before she answered, that the question he'd just asked had already been answered months ago by people whose names he'd never learn. "It's not emotional," she said quietly. "It's administrative. And it's already scheduled." Calla slowed her words the way people do when they know the next part will change how everything behind it is remembered, and Darnell felt his breath go shallow because he'd heard that cadence before, in hospital waiting rooms and legal offices, and the dispatcher's voice when they'd called to tell him his wife's accident had involved more than just weather. It was the sound of information that couldn't be softened, only delivered, and whatever Calla was about to say had weight that preceded its arrival. "The sitter you're paying tonight wasn't chosen randomly," she said, and Darnell's hands went cold against the brick wall behind him. 3 weeks ago, your dispatcher received a recommendation from the consortium's logistics coordinator, the kind of internal referral that sounds helpful when it arrives, someone reliable who needs work and has been vetted for families with single parents who work overnight routes. The recommendation came with a file. Your schedule, your daughter's school district, the address of the duplex near Wakarusa Creek. Darnell opened his mouth but no sound came out, because processing what Kala had just said required accepting that the woman he'd trusted to watch Nia, the woman who'd shown up early and texted updates without being asked, wasn't there because she needed work or because his dispatcher had been doing him a favor. She was there because someone had decided Darnell's life needed a variable that could be monitored. And the fastest way to monitor someone was to place yourself adjacent to the thing they cared about most. The freight company notified its insurer 6 months ago, Kaya continued, and her voice stayed steady, even though what she was describing felt like watching architecture collapse in slow motion. The notification said you would likely be unavailable within 6 months due to licensing irregularities. Nothing specific, nothing actionable. Just a note in the file that prepared the ground for future explanations. I don't have licensing irregularities, Darnell said, and the words came out harder than he'd intended. Almost angry, except the anger didn't have anywhere to land because there was no accusation to fight against, just documentation that had been filed before the irregularities it described had been invented. You don't, Kala agreed, but your routes have been adjusted incrementally over the past 8 months, pushing you closer to known loss corridors. Not enough to feel deliberate, but enough that when cargo goes missing within 40 miles of where you've been documented, the pattern starts to look like something more than coincidence. You're not being accused of anything. You're being positioned so that when the accusation becomes necessary, the paper trail already exists to make it credible. Darnell thought about the route changes he'd accepted without question, because freight logistics shifted all the time based on client needs and fuel costs and weather patterns, and he'd never considered that his willingness to adapt, his flexibility, his refusal to complain when schedules changed at the last minute, might be the exact quality someone needed him to demonstrate so they could use it against him later. Every time he'd said yes to a reroute, every time he'd taken the adjustment without pushing back, he'd been building the case they would eventually use to explain why his presence near missing cargo hadn't been accidental. Ellsworth, Darnell said quietly, and the word felt heavier now than it had when Kala first mentioned it. That's when this started. Kala nodded, and there was something in her expression that looked almost like sympathy, except sympathy would have required her to believe this could have gone differently. The night you stopped in Ellsworth was the first time the system recorded you as inconvenient, she said. You were supposed to be in Salina by midnight. You'd filed your logs. Your route was documented, but you stopped for a kid in a whiteout, and that decision kept you on the shoulder long enough that you weren't where the paperwork said you should be when cargo went missing from a warehouse 43 miles south. Darnell felt the ground shift beneath him, not literally but close enough that he had to focus on breathing to keep himself steady. The moment he'd stopped in Ellsworth, the moment he'd decided that leaving a 17-year-old kid freezing on the highway mattered more than staying on schedule, hadn't been proof of his character. It had been proof that his character made him unpredictable, and unpredictability in a system that needed fixed reference points was the same thing as liability. Your virtue created a problem, Kala said, and her voice was quieter now, almost apologetic in a way that made it worse, because apology suggested there had been a choice, and she'd chosen not to stop this before it started. The consortium needed drivers who stayed predictable, and you proved you'd choose ethics over logistics when those things came into conflict. That made you inconvenient, and inconvenient variables get reclassified. Darnell thought about Nia asleep back home, about the locks they checked together every night, about the way she'd started asking him if his routes were safe with a seriousness that hadn't been there a year ago, and realized the danger had never been the accusation. The danger was that the accusation had been prepared so carefully, so incrementally, that by the time it arrived he wouldn't have the language to explain why it was false. Because every piece of evidence they'd use against him would be technically accurate, even though the story those pieces told would be a lie. Nothing illegal has happened yet, Kala said, and the emphasis on yet made Darnell's chest tighten. That's the point. When it does, the paper trail will already exist, and by then, proving you didn't do what they're accusing you of will require proving that the system itself manufactured the circumstances that made the accusation possible, which is a case no one wants to bring because it implicates everyone involved in building it. For a moment there was space to breathe. Not because the weight of what Kala had explained had lifted, but because they'd reached the edge of what could be said without crossing into territory that would require decisions neither of them had prepared to make. The sidewalk stretched empty in both directions, and somewhere in the distance a siren moved south toward the river. And Darnell stood with his back against brick that still held the day's heat, and tried to understand what it meant to be told your future had been written by people who would never have to explain themselves. Kala looked away first, her gaze tracking the traffic that continued east without noticing the conversation happening on the sidewalk, and when she spoke again her voice carried something it hadn't before. Something that sounded less like professional distance and more like the kind of admission people make when they've already decided the cost of silence outweighs the safety it provides. "I shouldn't have told you any of this," she said quietly. "If my employer discovers I spoke off record, my career across Iowa and Ohio is over. Not suspended, not reviewed. Finished. The consortium doesn't tolerate variables that demonstrate independent judgment when that judgment conflicts with operational protocols." Darnell heard the echo of his own situation in her words, the way systems punish deviation even when deviation serves something more important than efficiency, and he understood that Kala wasn't exempt from the machinery she'd been describing. She'd been watching it long enough to recognize what it did to people who stayed inside its logic, without questioning whether that logic reflected anything resembling justice. And at some point in the months between Ellsworth appearing in her files and tonight, she'd made a choice about whether she wanted to keep mistaking distance for neutrality. "Why risk it?" Darnell asked, and the question came out quieter than he'd intended. Not because he didn't want to know, but because asking felt like acknowledging that her decision to speak had cost her something she couldn't recover. Kala was silent for a moment, and when she answered, her voice was steady, but the steadiness felt deliberate, like something she was holding in place through effort rather than ease. "Because I have a son," she said, "and watching a system prepare a quiet failure for someone who stopped to help him required me to decide whether I was willing to be the person who knew that was happening and chose to look away." Darnell thought about Nia checking the locks with him at night, about the seriousness in her voice when she asked if his routes were safe, about the way she'd started keeping her phone charged beside her bed, even though she was only 9 and shouldn't have to think about whether her father was coming home or getting disappeared into paperwork that would explain his absence without explaining what actually happened. The danger wasn't the accusation, he realized. The danger was never being told the rules had changed, never being given the chance to protect what mattered before the machinery started processing him into an explanation someone else needed. "I haven't agreed to help you," Darnell said. And the words felt necessary, even though they weren't entirely true, because saying them out loud gave him space to decide whether the help Kala was asking for was something he could afford to give. "And I haven't agreed to stay silent." "I know," Kala said, and there was no expectation in her voice, no pressure, just acknowledgement that the decision belonged to him, and she'd already said more than protocols allowed. "I'll be in St. Louis by morning. Louisville by the weekend. Following a chain that doesn't like being named." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a card that had nothing printed on it except a phone number written in pen, and she placed it on the ledge beside him without waiting to see if he'd take it. "I'm asking permission to call you before I file my next report," she said. "Not to pressure you. Just to tell you what I've found. You can answer or not. But I wanted to ask first." Darnell looked at the card, at the number that connected to someone who'd just dismantled his understanding of safety, and didn't pick it up or refuse it. The decision hung between them, deferred but not dismissed, and Kala nodded once in a way that suggested she understood that hesitation was the most honest answer he could give right now. Darnell drove west on 6th Street toward the bridge over Wakarusa Creek, the card Kala had left sitting in his passenger seat, where he'd placed it without deciding whether he'd ever use the number written on it. And the city thinned behind him as residential blocks gave way to the kind of Kansas landscape that looked empty at night but never actually was. Streetlights spaced themselves farther apart. The traffic that had felt constant on Massachusetts Street disappeared into residential driveways and parking lots, and by the time he crossed the bridge and turned north toward the duplex he shared with Nia, the only sound was the engine and the occasional rush of wind through the cracked window he kept open because enclosed spaces made him think too much. He thought about systems now, about how many lives bent under machinery they never saw, about how often dignity made someone useful in the wrong way, about how quietly futures were rearranged long before consequences arrived to announce themselves. The consortium Kala worked for wasn't unique. He understood that now. It was just visible to him, in a way most systems never became visible until they'd already finished processing you into whatever explanation they needed. How many other drivers were being positioned the same way he was? Their reliability documented, and their routes adjusted, and their names filed in reports that would sit dormant until someone needed a narrative that made expensive losses feel manageable? He wondered if any of them knew, if there were others who'd been told the rules had changed after they'd already committed to playing by them, or if most people went through their entire lives never learning that the categories used to organize their behavior had been designed by people who would never have to justify the damage those categories caused when they stopped fitting the humans they were supposed to describe. The thought made his hands tighten on the steering wheel, not from anger exactly, but from something close to it. The kind of frustration that comes from understanding you've been playing a game where the referee was also writing the rules and editing the score in real time. Subscribe before quiet compliance costs someone everything. The duplex appeared on his right, modest and familiar, the porch light on the way he'd left it, and Darnell pulled into the gravel driveway and sat for a moment with the engine still running, listening to the quiet that always preceded difficult decisions. Inside, Nia would be asleep with the hallway light on and her phone charging beside her bed, trusting that her father would come home because he always came home, and the weight of that trust felt heavier now than it had this morning, when he'd left for a date he'd thought was about building something normal. He turned off the engine and reached for the door handle, and that's when his phone vibrated once against the console between the seats. The screen lighting up with a number he didn't recognize, an area code that registered somewhere in his memory as Indiana, even though he couldn't remember the last time anyone from Indiana had called him for a reason that mattered. He stared at the screen until it went dark again. The call unanswered but not dismissed, and understood that whatever Kala had set in motion by speaking to him tonight had already started moving through channels he couldn't see, involving people he'd never meet, building towards something he no longer had the luxury of pretending wasn't his problem. The house was quiet in the way houses only get after 9 on a Thursday, the kind of quiet that felt deliberate rather than accidental, and Darnell moved through the front door without turning on the overhead light, because the hallway lamp Nia always left on cast enough glow to navigate by. Her backpack sat on the chair by the entrance where it wasn't supposed to be. Geometry homework, visible through the open zipper, and he could smell the faint residue of microwaved popcorn from whatever movie the sitter had let her watch before bed. He walked past the kitchen where 2 bowls sat drying in the rack, past the living room where the television was off but still warm to the touch, and stopped outside Nia's bedroom door that she kept cracked exactly 3 inches because fully closed made her nervous in ways she hadn't needed to explain since her mother died. Inside, she was asleep on her side with one arm draped over the edge of the mattress, and her phone charging on the nightstand beside a glass of water she'd asked for but hadn't finished. And Darnell stood in the doorway watching her breathe with the kind of attention parents develop when they understand that safety isn't guaranteed by intention alone. She looked smaller than 9, the way children always do when they're asleep and their defenses have dropped, and Darnell thought about the sitter who'd been here tonight, about the recommendation that had come from his dispatcher with Nia's school district and their address already attached, and felt something cold settle in his chest, because the vulnerability he was looking at right now wasn't abstract, it was tangible. It was the thing systems could leverage when they needed someone to stop asking questions, and the realization that his reliability as a father had been mapped and documented the same way his reliability as a driver had been mapped and documented made the hallway feel smaller than it was. He adjusted the blanket she'd kicked halfway off, turned the hallway lamp down to its lowest setting, and walked back to the living room where his phone sat on the coffee table still lit with the missed call notification from Indiana. He picked it up, stared at the number long enough to memorize it without meaning to, and understood that answering would mean admitting the evening on Massachusetts Street hadn't been an aberration but the beginning of something that would require decisions he wasn't ready to make. But not answering felt like pretending nothing had changed, like believing silence could protect what mattered when silence was exactly what systems relied on to finish their work without interruption. So he didn't answer the call. He didn't delete it, either. He left his phone on the coffee table with the screen facing up, ringer on, and sat on the couch in the dark listening to the house settle and the refrigerator hum and the occasional car pass on the street outside, and knew that the story he'd thought was ending tonight had actually just shown him which chapter he'd already been written into and how little time he had left to decide whether he was going to let it stay that way. Sleep didn't come, not in any form that counted as rest, and by the time dawn began graying the kitchen window, Darnell had moved through every room in the duplex twice, checking locks that were already secure and windows that hadn't been opened in weeks, acting out routines that had always felt like protection, but now felt like performance for an audience he couldn't locate. The Indiana number had called twice more during the night, each time letting it ring exactly 6 times before disconnecting. And he'd sat on the couch watching his phone light up with mathematical precision and understood that whoever was on the other end wasn't leaving messages because messages created records and records were the thing they were trying to avoid creating until they couldn't avoid it anymore. Nia would be awake in an hour. He'd need to make breakfast and check her homework and drive her to school before his shift started. And the ordinary architecture of single parenthood, that had felt manageable yesterday now felt like scaffolding built over a foundation that someone had been quietly excavating for months. Every decision he made from this point forward would be legible to systems that had already decided what his decisions meant before he made them. And the trap wasn't that he'd chosen wrong, but that choosing right had made him visible in ways he couldn't undo. He thought about Cala Monroe somewhere between Lawrence and Street Lewis by now, following corridors that connected insurance fraud and freight logistics and bureaucratic efficiency, and wondered how many other conversations like the one they'd had last night were happening in restaurants and parking lots and highway rest stops across Kansas and Missouri and Illinois and Indiana. How many people were being told the paperwork had already been filed, and the explanations had already been written, and the only question that mattered was whether they were going to participate in correcting the narrative, or whether they were going to let the narrative correct them. She'd said she'd be in Louisville by the weekend, which meant the chain she was following didn't stop at state lines, didn't pause for weekends, didn't require anyone's permission to keep processing people into categories that justified whatever losses needed justifying. The consortium wasn't evil. That was what made it difficult to fight. It was efficient. It was responsive. It solved problems for companies that needed solutions. And if those solutions required human beings to absorb consequences they hadn't earned, that wasn't cruelty. It was optimization. And optimization didn't require malice to destroy lives. It just required everyone involved to agree that the categories they were using to organize reality were more important than the reality those categories were supposed to describe. Darnell picked up his phone and stared at the Indiana number again, at the 3 missed calls stacked on his notification screen like invitations to a conversation he knew would change everything regardless of what he said or didn't say, and realized that answering wouldn't give him information. Answering would give them confirmation that he knew, and once they had confirmation that he knew, the timeline they'd been building would accelerate because known variables required different handling than unknown ones. But not answering meant letting them believe he was still operating under the assumption that the rules he'd been following were the rules that mattered, and that assumption, that gap between what he knew and what they thought he knew, might be the only leverage he had left. He thought about Nia sleeping in the next room, about the geometry homework she'd finished this morning at the kitchen table while he made eggs she'd eat too fast, about the way she checked the locks with him now, serious and methodical, absorbing his anxiety without understanding where it came from. She deserved a father who could protect her from systems that prepared failures in advance. But protection required understanding which version of himself those systems had already decided he was, and whether the distance between that version and the truth was something he could use or something that would bury him before he had a chance to correct it. The phone vibrated again, same number, same 6 rings, same silence when he didn't answer, and Darnell stood in the hallway as dawn light continued to gray the kitchen window, the device still trembling in his hand with persistence that suggested whoever was calling had instructions to keep trying until connection was established, and realized that knowing the rules had changed didn't mean he knew which version of himself would survive learning how to play by them. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up, engines starting, doors closing, lives resuming their ordinary trajectories because most people would never know their trajectories had been mapped by institutions that needed predictable variables to absorb unpredictable losses. Darnell had been one of those people 48 hours ago. Now he was standing in his hallway holding a phone that connected him to a system that had been preparing his failure for months. And the only decision that mattered was whether he was going to answer before they decided his silence meant something worse than cooperation. The phone went dark again. Morning arrived without announcement. And Darnell Whitaker understood, with the kind of clarity that arrives too late to prevent what's already been set in motion but early enough to matter in ways he couldn't predict yet, that the story he'd thought was ending had been running parallel to his entire life, and the only difference now was that he could see it, which meant he could no longer pretend the choices ahead belonged to someone else.